Octopus are an alien intelligence. 700 million years ago, their ancestors split from the rest of the animal kingdom, embarking on a completely separate evolutionary journey. They independently evolved a nervous system so strange that scientists can't even agree how many brains they have. 1, 8, 9, depends who you ask. And the kind of intelligence they evolved is nothing like our own. Humans thrive on social cognition. We track reputations, feel empathy, and build relationships. Octopuses? They're complete loners. They're lone cowboys. And yet they learn, problem solve, and play entirely through physical interactions with their environment. Which brings us to one of the most puzzling mysteries in all of evolution.
No octopus really meets either parent. The octopuses that you'll encounter snorkeling between 1 and 2 years is basically all they've got.
Why? Why would evolution set up such a marvelously complex and intelligent organism only to program all of these chemical pathways in it to basically end its life so soon?
The question of whether they're programmed to end in that sense, that's very controversial in evolutionary theory. Although some people think that.
Dr. Peter Godfrey-Smith is a philosopher of biology, animal consciousness researcher, and the world's most articulate octopus whisperer. He's the author of Other Minds, a globally best-selling book that cracked open the mystery of animal consciousness by bringing us face-to-face with the alien intelligence of cephalopods. His follow-up, Metazoa, took us even deeper, mapping how subjective experience may have emerged from the first twitching jellyfish all the way to the rise of human minds. He has fundamentally reshaped how scientists, philosophers, and the public think about what consciousness really is, where it comes from, and why we might need to seriously double think how we treat these truly marvelous and puzzling creatures. Subscribe if you want to know why the smartest creature in the ocean dies after a single mating session and what that says about you.
One of the things that's happened is the evolution of subjectivity in a strong sense of that term. The evolution of a perspective, a point of view, an orientation to the world. I think experience is a feature of biological systems of a certain kind with a certain complexity. Arguments that became influential in the late 20th century and that still have a lot of influence that suggests that the hardware doesn't matter, that ordinary computer hardware would be fine if you just programmed it in the right way. You could get a sentient and experiencing system that way. We both don't believe that.
What do you think is so special about humans that gives us such a rich subjective experience? If there's things in the brain that's creating consciousness, why haven't we figured more stuff out about how consciousness is working in the brain? What should the next few decades in consciousness research look like under your view?
Okay, well, I've become very concerned about
what is the lifespan of an octopus?
Short. It's an important fact, short. For most species, less than 2 years. There's the really big ones, the giant Pacific octopuses, can go for about 4 years, and there's a deep sea species that's known to live quite a lot longer, but they live these incredibly slow-paced lives. So with the octopuses that you'll encounter snorkeling and the common species around the place, the medium-sized shallow water octopuses, between 1 and 2 years is basically all they've got.
It's the most astounding fact. I read it this morning for the first time that I could remember, and I couldn't believe it. I immediately fact-check it. My girlfriend didn't believe it. When you look at the marvelous complexity of these animals, and I've been fortunate enough to go scuba diving in Indonesia and Thailand, and I've seen them in the wild. 1 to 2 years just doesn't jive. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's such a strange disconnect from what you see.
I agree. It is a disconnect. The animals that really startled me on this front are their relatives, the giant cuttlefish, who are among the first, well, pretty much the first cephalopods I hung out with for a decent amount of time. And, they're very behaviorally complex, like octopuses, and they're quite large. They're up to a meter or so long. And they also have a somewhat, some of them have a kind of old man look, a kind of world weary look. And when I met them in the sea for the first times, I just assumed that these were old animals and they'd gotten
Right.
used to people and they had this wealth of experience as individuals. Then I found out that they too live for 1 to 2 years. It was quite shocking.
Why? Why would evolution set up such a marvelously complex and intelligent organism only to program all of these chemical pathways in it to basically end its life so soon?
The question of whether they're programmed to end in that sense, that's very controversial in
Okay.
evolutionary theory. Although some people think that. I mean, there's a woman who's starting a new project of research on octopus aging who I think pretty much does think that. I looked at her website. I've actually forgotten her name, but I caught it. She caught my attention. I looked at her website, and she uses that language. Whereas in the book Other Minds, I don't use that language. I'm cautious about that because it makes it sound like, in the context of Darwinian evolution, there's a point at which this individual organism should go, either for the good of the species or for some other reason, rather than it just, falling apart or running out of what it takes or going into a kind of natural senescence, basically. Now, from that point of view, the question is why some animals enter a process of decay and senescence so much more quickly than others.
Right.
Many decades in our case, much less than a decade in an octopus's case. You've got superficially similar animals, rats and bats, where bats live much longer than rats. Now, why is that? It pretty much can't be the design of the body. People talk about the octopus case that way. It's something about the cephalopod design. I don't believe it. I mean, one reason I don't believe it is the fact that nautiluses, who are cephalopods but a bit further away, they can live for a long time. They can live for a couple of decades, apparently. They have a more or less similar resources in their bodies, but they go on for much longer. So the story probably has to be one in terms of some kind of advantage to, investment in the first year or 2 years of life, going for broke, going really hard, trying to get big. In the case of female octopuses, it'd be hard to have more than one batch, one clutch of eggs, partly because looking after the eggs is such a physically taxing thing for the female octopuses. They hold them and fan them with water, and they don't eat during the time that they're brooding the eggs. So at the end of that, they're really fried. And you can imagine a situation from an evolutionary point of view where the octopuses who went really hard at that first clutch of eggs did well, and it didn't matter that they then fell apart soon after. And falling apart then just becomes, I'll say a bit about this in a minute, but it becomes sort of just part of the schedule, part of the expected schedule. And an octopus that tries to save something for next year or for at least a second clutch of eggs might just do worse in evolutionary terms. Now that makes complete sense to me for the females. It doesn't make
Right.
total sense for the males. I don't get it for the
Right.
males. Why they couldn't be just a bit disconnected from the schedule that the females are on. I'll just follow up one little bit. There's some elegant evolutionary theorizing about, why it is that once you start going for broke, trying to reproduce as much as you can early, there tends to be an accumulation of mutations that act after that point. You're essentially paying the price late for vigor and success early, and those mutations can give you the appearance of a kind of programmed falling apart rather than just a falling apart. And that all makes sense. The thing I say that doesn't make complete sense is the males.
Yeah, it's just so astounding You talk about vigor and complexity. Give a sense of the quantity of eggs that these female octopus are laying in one go.
I couldn't actually give you a number. It would vary a lot by species, but certainly hundreds and hundreds. I mean, some number on that scale, a lot.
So everything, I believe it's called the Big Bang reproduction strategy, which is eloquently named.
Right.
Everything is set up between the female and the male octopus to orchestrate their bodies in such a way that they can grow to a level of complexity, and then they have one mating session, and then they basically both of them end their lives via either what we talked about, the apoptotic cell death pathways possibly activating, or possibly the natural breaking down in the organism. But that just seems like such a strange evolutionary answer. I mean, why?
Right. Well, look, you do still have to deal with the males. It's not as if the male
Yeah.
octopus and the female octopus get together, form a partnership, work together on the production of one high quality clutch of eggs, and then they're both done. Not like that. The male is long gone. The male probably only interacted with that female in the context of mating
Yeah.
and may have gone off and mated with some other females. But for some reason, apparently, he's just on a similar schedule to her. Now, in the case of her, right, it's a kind of it's a big bang, go for broke, do it all now strategy. And if we ask, why should octopuses be doing that when other animals don't? The answer that's usually given has quite a lot to do with external risks of death, predation especially. I mean, if you imagine a situation where you're at a certain age and you could either spend all your resources reproducing in one season or try to get over to the next season as well. But your chances of getting to the next season are not very high because you're surrounded by sharks and seals and dolphins and everyone's trying to eat you. Then it would be reasonable to think, no, this is not going to work. I should just do the whole thing in one go. So that all fits together. That fits together. And apparently this is thought to be an explanation for why bats and rats have quite different lifespans. Bats being longer. The life of a bat is less perilous than the life of a rat. There's a lot that's going to get you if you're a rat. Bats, because they can fly, they have a decent chance of evading external threats. And because of that, it makes sense to have a body that will naturally last a bit longer.
How much of octopus intelligence and consciousness makes more sense under this constraint of only living for sort of 18 to 24 months? Do you think that kind of frames its behavior in a particular way?
I think it makes the problem harder. I think it makes the situation weirder. Think about learning, for example. Learning probably takes a certain amount of machinery and it's expensive to have that stuff on board. One would think that if you're going to be a good learner, you would want to be able to live long enough to put that experience to use. You spend a certain amount of time gathering information, then a decent amount of time making use of it. But if you're rushing through your life and the whole thing's going to be over in less than 2 years, why be a good learner? It's quite, and why have all this expensive stuff in your head, all this expensive hardware? So I think the situation with lifespan makes the problem more puzzling. It doesn't sort of frame it in a helpful way. It sort of frames it in a even more unhelpful way.
Right. Maybe some of my instincts were ill-fitting in sort of how I was putting the picture together. So, is it common for these hatchlings to be born basically without either of their parents? I'm right in saying that pretty much all of octopus learning is not from cultural transmission. There isn't really any parent to child teaching of how to hunt, how to move, how to do anything really, because most of the time they're not around.
Right. That's right. No octopus really meets either parent. The The females, the females hold the eggs and protect the eggs and fan them with water for oxygenation. The eggs hatch, the little larvae become part of the plankton, basically. They drift up into the water column and just become part of the plankton. And, most of them will not last very long, but a handful will last a little while. And then when they get a bit bigger, they settle back on the sea floor, but they could have drifted many miles from where they started. The mother's probably gone. Who knows what happened with dad? Right. No cross-cultural learning of the sort seen in some birds and mammals. Nothing like that. Probably no significant cultural learning of a kind of sideways type as well. This is not completely clear. There was a controversial study about 35 years ago now, which raised the possibility that individuals could observe other individual octopuses doing something and acquire a skill or pick up a habit that way. And there were attempts to replicate it. I've lost track of where that went, but certainly I think it's remained controversial, basically. Right, so all the learning is kind of individualistic, ground up. It's just me. Here's my experience type learning.
Right. And that's sort of why we see octopus doing all of these really interesting behaviors like opening jars. Like you can understand if you just have innately wired, very high curiosity to explore your environment, it will
Yep.
just start twisting things, it will rotate objects, it will move things around because all of its learning has to basically exist within the interaction of the organism and its environment. There's no cultural transmission. So it's going to have a natural wiring to just rotate objects, see if things fit into things. What happens if I shove my tentacle in this hole? Oh, I've flooded the tank and now the whole science lab is full of water, squirting water at bulbs, all these very strange behaviors that you observe.
That's right. That's right. You can imagine an animal that had no social learning, that wasn't exploratory and just waited for experiences to come along. I mean, that's possible. But as you say, the way octopuses do it is not like that. They've got this engaged, exploratory approach to things. They're always feeling things, twisting them, trying to work out, can I pull this thing apart? I mean, the can I pull this thing apart instinct or tendency makes a lot of sense in just as far as foraging goes, trying to find new food sources. But I think at least some species have a sort of standing, ongoing curiosity about objects that goes far beyond just, might there be food inside this thing. At one point at the site Octopus, the high density site that I've studied for a while, which maybe we should talk about at some stage. I should give an update on it apart from anything else. At one point at that site, I took down some stakes. I wanted to mark the corners essentially of the site and see if it was getting bigger or smaller. And the very next time I went down there, an octopus had pulled out one of the stakes and taken it back to the central den and was kind of holding it. So I gave up on that. And surprisingly to me, I've forgotten how many years later, I think it was about 2 years later, I was there, maybe even more than 2 years. And that stake was still being kept at at that central den. And there would have been octopus turnover for sure.
Yeah.
There would have been other disturbances. There are storms and things like that. I think it had been kept around because it was interesting. I think that's the natural. I don't have another explanation for why this object, which would have immediately shown didn't have any food inside it, was sort of kept around.
Talk more about these scuba diving adventures with these octopus, because I love the stories that you lay out in the book. You just gain such an empathy for the animals, and then again, that's why it's so shocking to hear that they're not old wise creatures experienced through many years of evading predation, and
Right.
they just evoke some like, oh, that thing must have lived a life, but they're basically babies, and they never, I guess in a human perspective, they're babies and never emerge out of that.
They're sort of babies, but once they get going, they do a lot in that short time. One of the things, actually, I didn't write about this in any of the books, but something I noticed at a certain point is that very small octopuses who must be very young, at least of the species that I hang out with, the gloomy octopus, really small ones, not much bigger than a matchbox. They're often the most exploratory and the most active and the most interested, and they're really doing lots of stuff. I mean, sometimes they can be quite timid, which makes sense if you're absolutely tiny, but they're very active. So they have this short life, but they make the most of it. I don't know how long these little guys, how old these little guys would be, but not very old, and they're very, very exploratory. Okay, yeah, I'll say a little bit. I'll just summarize some information about the special sites. My friend Matt Lawrence discovered the first of the. Well, he's my friend now. He wasn't my friend when he discovered them because I got in touch after I'd heard about this. He discovered a site in Jervis Bay, which is about 3 hours south of Sydney, where he's turned up one day doing an exploratory dive on his own, and there's about a dozen octopuses sort of messing around with each other, wrestling, going in and out of dens in this small area. Matt's not a scientist or an academic sort of person, but he knew this was unusual, and he put on a website this report. And someone who is a scientist, Chrissy Hufford, who's a ecologist and octopus biologist, noticed this and mentioned to me. She said, hang on, isn't that not too far from where you are, where you live at least part of the time? And it was close by. So I got in contact with Matt and went down. And the first couple of times I went there wasn't that much going on. There was just a couple of octopuses. But I persisted, and soon we were starting to see large numbers again, really large numbers. The largest number I think we've seen at the site was, actually, I'm forgetting if it was 14 or 16, something like that, in the mid-teens. In a very small area. It's a sort of an oval about 2 by 1 meters or something like that. So you get a lot of octopuses sort of wrestling and poking each other, not doing anything cooperative so far as we can tell. It's very much a slightly, often looks like a slightly grumpy coexistence with a lot of low-key wrestling, and occasionally some really vigorous fights. Sometimes there'll be really intense fights between males. We take it at least much of the time. Sometimes we know it's males, not always. We've never seen these fights are very intense looking. Never actually seen an octopus seriously harmed by one of these fights. I think it's if you're an octopus, it's quite difficult to do serious damage to another octopus. You've got this soft body, and they've got this soft body that can, you can't really put it in much of a headlock, break bones or anything like that.
Right.
Punching underwater, it doesn't do that much damage, even no matter how strong you are. And they are very strong. Yeah, so they have these big fights, and usually no harm is done. Now, I've been going there for a long time now, and we've written a couple of scientific papers about the site, looking at the ecology, looking at some signaling behaviors, most recently looking at these sort of jet-propelled projectile, so jet-propelled throwing behavior there. Unfortunately, right now, it's extremely quiet. There's almost nothing going on there. I was down there maybe a couple of months ago now. I think there were just 2 octopuses, not doing anything much. The site has gone up and down quite a lot over the years. We've seen it down to about 2 in the past, and it's come back. I hope it comes back again.
Yeah.
But it's very quiet right now.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. I also bought one for my girlfriend, and she also loves it. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really, really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep, so this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable. Literally is just a really high quality, well-made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally, and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more. Are they hierarchical animals? You know, a lot of wrestling and play is establishing sort of a hierarchy within the clan. Do you notice, is there an octopus hierarchy of any discernible nature?
It wouldn't be a clan in the relatedness sense, most likely, because of the way that the reproduction system works. I think some individuals find the site and settle there and have to pretty much just learn how to get on with each other to the extent that they get on with each other. Hierarchical makes it sound more organized than it perhaps is. A typical scene, we're going back a few years now. The peak time for the most animals was around 2014 to about 2018 or so. Hasn't been the same since COVID, although I doubt that was the cause. And at the peak time, you would often have, or you'd sometimes have one individual who is kind of dominating to some extent, a male in the cases where we looked closely. And this individual would try to exclude other males, and they would be sneaking onto the site sometimes, or they would be confronting this one sometimes. There was one individual during the best of the seasons that we watched them closely for I say season, but the filming was only for a few days, about 3 days. And he had countless fights with other individuals that time. He only lost one fight. It was interesting. He wasn't the biggest octopus on the site, but he was just determined to control it, it seemed. And he'll be often just roaming around the central area. Other octopuses will come in, and in some cases, he just lets them come in. And presumably that's because they're females, and he has no problem with additional females hanging out at the site. In some cases, he just lets them come in. In some cases, he doesn't. He'll exclude them. He'll try to fight them. And, it's hard. It's hard for us to tell the sexes apart. It's hard for them to tell the sexes apart, we're pretty sure. I've seen some cases, one or two cases, where I think there was kind of mistaken identification of the sexes. But we think, typically was trying to keep females in, keep other males out. Now, usually there was at least one other male around, sometimes on the periphery of the site, either unseen perhaps, or too much hassle to keep kicking him out. No need to spend all your energy doing this. So often there'd be a second male, maybe, I think, and sometimes there'd be a third, more females, insofar as he can control the site, often about 5, something like that. And that'd be a fairly typical scene at the kind of peak time where we watch them closely around 2015. And in other years when we spent a fair bit of time there, it looked fairly similar. So I think that's a fairly typical scene. No cooperation. That we never saw anything that looked like cooperation. We're not even sure what that would be. I guess it would be either cooperatively kicking out a male, you could imagine that, taking over the way that some species do. They form coalitions to get rid of the alpha male. That's seen in some, non-octopus, very much non-octopus species. Like gorillas, for example, you see that. And so, no cooperative building or anything like that. The name Octopolis I have sometimes regretted because it made it sound like a real city, which it definitely isn't. It's just, you've just got dens which are burrows. Very impressive often. They're these very neat shafts, over 50 centimeters deep in some cases, and very neatly lined with shells, but just individual dens. Yes, I mean, hierarchy in a loose sense is often someone trying to control the space.
Yes.
But not in the context of organized social behavior.
Right. So puzzling. There's just so many elements of their evolution that just don't make any sense. Why they wouldn't be able to even discern males from females, right? It's hard to imagine how that is ever maybe as a camouflage, or maybe to be
no, I think
unidentified to other.
In that case, I think it's just, this is an unusual site. They're having to deal with things they don't usually have to deal with, like a lot of other octopuses. I don't think this is typical for the species. So I think a reasonable picture is one where, you're an octopus, you're hanging out, there's no other octopuses around. You come across another octopus, you got plenty of time to work out if that's a male, same sex or different sex from yourself, and whether that's a good or a bad thing. The sort of pace of life at Octopolis is unusual and brings out these unusual behaviors. Right, so I wouldn't extrapolate from them to others with respect to that feature.
Okay. Dive into the nervous system of the octopus so everyone can really understand how the nervous system is laid out.
Well, firstly, it's big. In the standard number given, although I think we need an update here, there are some new methods for counting neurons that I don't think have been applied to octopuses yet. But the standard number is about 500 million neurons, which is, really big. It's getting into the vertebrate range, and well beyond other invertebrate animals. Most of that, in the case of the octopus, though, most of those neurons are not in the central brain. They're spread through the body, especially in the upper arm. So something like 2/3 is the estimate. So you've got a lot of control machinery outside of the central brain. And, we should probably spend some time discussing why that might be. But with the central brain itself is pretty big, and it's a you might think of it as a kind of expanded and intellectualized version of a mollusk or other invertebrate brain, where there are ganglia, knots of neurons. It's the way a lot of invertebrate brains are organized, like a collection of knots organized in like what's sometimes called a ladder-like system with these knots of neurons. But in the octopus, a lot of those ganglia are sort of concentrated and enlarged in the central area. It's more weird stuff. The esophagus goes straight through the middle of the brain, which is a very, I mean, you were saying a minute ago there are things that don't make any sense. That's definitely something that
It
doesn't
doesn't make any sense.
make a lot of sense. If you get a bone stuck in your throat, it can go straight into your brain. If you're an octopus, it's like a donut shaped structure with the esophagus running through it. There's a thing called the vertical lobe, which is an unpaired thing up the top in the middle that's kind of thought to be the center of a lot of the more sophisticated capacities. Very loosely analogous to the cerebral hemispheres in us, but it's not that. It doesn't have. There's not two of them. There's just one of them. Yeah. So the neurons themselves are not that much different from our neurons. There are some differences apparently, but some significant differences in just the cell layout between vertebrate and invertebrate neurons. But that's not the big thing. The big thing is they've taken this design that was laid down in evolution for a very different kind of animal, a smaller brained animal, and concentrated neurons in the central brain, brought those ganglia together, expanded them, and actually I should say there's also two big structures behind each eye, the optic lobes, which are thought to be the center of also some sophisticated processing, dealing with visual input. And then you have all that machinery that's out in the body. It's just not in the central brain at all. More than half of the neurons spread through the body.
In what capacity do you think the system is one system, or is it that kind of school playground myth of like, oh, octopus have 9 brains? Like, how much truth do you think there is to something like that?
I didn't think it was a school playground myth, but I'm glad octopuses are making their way to the school. Octopus neurobiology is making its way to the school playground.
It was hot topic in my school playground. I don't know about you.
Well, I mean, the first thing to say in favor of the school playground picture, I mean, one of the reasons I got very interested in this was a passage in an old book, which for years was the main textbook on cephalopod behavior, called Cephalopod Behavior, by Roger Hanlon and John Messenger. I mean, Hanlon especially is one of the absolutely central figures in octopus and other cephalopod behavior. Very important figure in all this stuff. And towards the back of their book, Cephalopod Behavior, this very sober textbook, and I never forgot this phrase. They say, oh yeah, you have tons of neurons in each of the arms, and in some ways the arms seem, this is now a quote, curiously divorced from the central brain. The nervous systems in the arms seem curiously divorced from the central brain. And I read that and I thought, hang on, I have to tell everybody in the playground about
exactly.
about this one. It was very surprising way of writing. And that book was in 1998. There's a new edition now. I haven't actually, now that I realize, I haven't looked at whether that phrase exists also in the second edition of this book. But what it suggests is the possibility of a fair bit of independence, curiously divorced. And then the question since then has been, how much independence? What relationship is there? And nobody really knows. I think it's fair to say. There's lots of speculative pictures, and I'll offer a speculative picture in a moment. On the experimental side, the lab that's really had a go at this is Benny Hockner's lab at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, in Israel. They've some people there, Tamar Gutnick especially, it was a paper with her as first author when she was there, have tried to work out, some pretty basic questions like, can an octopus send a single arm down a particular path in a visually guided way, where the arm can't be tracking a path to food by, tasting chemicals or smelling the water or something like that. Can it be done in a way that's visually guided? So in their experiment, an octopus learned the location of food, but to get there, it had to bring its arm out of the water and direct it from partially out of the water to the target. And the octopuses could learn to do that. They could, right? So that's helpful. So that shows that an octopus, the central octopus, the single unified central octopus, using its eyes, can control a specific targeted behavior with one arm. Now, in that paper, Gutnick and her collaborators, they say in passing almost, they say, yeah, that's how it goes. It's interesting, though, that the arm looks like it's doing its own kind of exploration when it's, as it goes, when it's in the watery part of this system. And, this is now my speculative picture. There are some things octopuses do which have a lot of unity and cohesion. For example, an octopus can be sitting looking like its body is sort of all over the place. Then it can pull itself together into a missile shape and use jet propulsion to go in a very specific direction, using the jet with all the arms out behind it, for streamlining. So it looks like a missile, as I say. Now, that requires that the animal just act as a whole, act as a unit. There's also the behavior that our most recent paper from a couple of years ago now, based on the Octopus site, was about, which is this jet-propelled throwing behavior, where an octopus sometimes gathers a bunch of debris, shells and sand and stuff in its arms, and then brings its jet propulsion device under the arms into an unusual position and sort of fires, essentially. It sort of releases a jet of water as it opens its arms up, and all this stuff comes rocketing out.
Confetti cannon type.
Yeah, although it can hit another octopus, and the other octopus sometimes acts as if this was, quite a significant impact. It doesn't look as if this was a shower of confetti, although it is underwater. Right. It's hard to get projectiles to move much underwater. We have a paper in PLOS One that describes this, and it has some videos. Anyway, when an octopus is doing that, again, it seems very unified. It's got to get a whole body behavior to work that involves the coordination of the arms, the jet propulsion device. It's got to release the arms when the jet propulsion device fires its jet of water. It looks to us, at least sometimes, like there's a degree of targeting with the eyes. So all that stuff suggests a good deal of behavioral unity and hence cognitive unity. But then you have the other things you see sometimes. If you're watching an octopus just hanging out at the den or watching it forage, roaming around, it often looks like each of the arms is sort of just following its own path and doing so in a way that certainly has no obvious visual guidance. And that need not be a big deal because, a person can do that. They can just let their arms explore, but we know that's coming from the central nervous system. Your arms as a human can't literally guide an action, not except for the most trivial, like knee reflex type cases. So we know, in the human case, it's a centrally directed behavior. In the octopus case, there's all this machinery in there. And there are experiments where arms have been cut off and they can behave at least semi-coherently individually for a short time. So my suspicion is that when an octopus is, awake but not doing anything too serious, it lets the arms just kind of go sometimes. And the arms explore and they have a certain amount of autonomy. I think that's not a crazy picture at all. Each of the arms has a certain amount of autonomy. And then the octopus can sometimes pull itself together when if a predator arrives or a rival or there's something important going on, it can pull itself together and act as a whole. So I would suggest that this is again speculative for sure. I would suggest that there can definitely be episodes of significant unity, cohesion. And there can be episodes where the central brain just kind of lets the peripheral system follow its own way to some extent. Each of those arms has countless sensors. They can sense chemicals and surfaces. There's a lot of sensitivity there. There's a lot of potential directedness of action at the level of the arms if it was sort of allowed to do its thing. And to me, it seems a reasonable, an empirically informed speculation that sometimes they are allowed to do their own thing.
So fascinating. So interesting. What you talk a lot in the book about the features and things that need to come together for an animal to have a subjective experience or a consciousness. Talk about what an organism needs to bring together in your view, in your theory, to have an individual experience of being that organism.
Right, we're going from speculative to more tendentious, inevitably. So I would
Absolutely.
preface it all with that, but
Absolutely, we are.
But with that in mind, the book where I have a real go at offering a picture in this area is the second book in the trilogy, the book Metazoa, which came after Other Minds. And the story there, I mean, the way that book works is we walk through the evolution of animals and animal behavior from very early times, from before the Cambrian. And the book's guided by the fact that there's 3 different animal groups that have given rise to some species where you see, really conspicuously complex behavior. Good eyes, rapid motion, targeted motion, sophisticated learning, navigation, things like that. And the 3 groups are, our group, vertebrates, arthropods, the group that includes insects and spiders, and just this small group within the mollusks, the cephalopods. And I think there are 3 groups that do this conspicuously. And the book Metazoa tries to walk through the similarities and differences of each of those groups. It looks at the evidence, such as there is, of actual experience in each of those groups. In our group, vertebrates, lots of evidence for subjective experience in non-humans, and there's us as well. In octopuses, there's, I think, good evidence. The evidence for pain, especially due to the work of Robin Crook in San Francisco, is pretty good evidence that octopuses can feel acute pain of an injury. They certainly, act in a sophisticated way that suggests that. In the arthropods, Robert Elwood, some time ago, has made a strong case for pain or pain-like experiences in crustaceans, especially hermit crabs. And since the 3 of my books were published, the evidence for pain in insects has gotten a lot stronger, especially due to work out of the lab of Lars Chitka. Gibbons is the first author in the most important paper. Matilda Gibbons, this came out a couple of years ago, suggesting pain-like experience in bumblebees. Right, so you have these 3 groups where there's evidence for pain, there's behavioral complexity, there's navigation and learning and targeted motion and so on. And within their different styles, I think in each of those 3 groups, one of the things that's happened is the evolution of subjectivity in a strong sense of that term, the evolution of a perspective, a point of view, an orientation to the world. That evolutionary process, I think, is roughly speaking a consequence of the evolution of agency. Action, agency, behavior is part of the animal way of being, and it's especially refined and developed in those three groups. But if you're going to have coherent agency, I think subjectivity comes along with that. You start to be a system to whom things seem a certain way. You become a center of converging sensory lines, and you become the initiator of outward causal lines in behavior. So part of the story I would tell in terms of the special properties of subjectivity as an evolutionary product, and one that makes sense in the context of the evolution of agency. And the other part of the story, the second part of the story, involves peculiarities of nervous systems themselves. I think that there's reasonable evidence, or it's far from a crazy view, that the peculiar properties of nervous systems, of that kind of biological machinery, have something important to do with the formation or the creation of subjective experience. I understand that you had Anil Seth on the podcast not that long ago. So Anil and I are kind of in the same camp on some issues, including the importance of the biology, basically, the importance of the peculiarities of nervous systems. And we both think that arguments that became influential in the late 20th century and that still have a lot of influence, that suggests that the hardware doesn't matter, that ordinary computer hardware would be fine if you just programmed it in the right way. You could get a sentient and experiencing system that way. We both don't believe that. We both think that nervous systems are probably important for somewhat different reasons. In my case, the thing I would point to as potentially important and as a kind of bridge between the biological and the experiential is the combination in nervous systems of point-to-point networked influences. This neuron makes that neuron fire, and so on, and more diffuse, large-scale dynamic patterns that involve electrical oscillation at a slower pace, below the threshold of neural firing, large scale in the sense of unifying the activity of much or all of the brain, the kind of thing seen in EEG recordings, basically. Now, in adventurous parts of neuroscience, gamma waves in the brain have for a while, fast 40 hertz, 40 cycles per second waves, have for a while been thought to have some association with conscious experience, especially on the perceptual side. People like Wolf Singer, Lucia Maloney, Francis Crick, and Christoph Koch has changed his mind a bit, but he was in this camp for a good while, have thought that the kind of unification that those large-scale dynamic patterns in the brains, those large-scale dynamic patterns give to the brain is important in explaining experience, where it's the unified features of experience that have an explanatory connection, perhaps, to these features of brains. So, some decades ago now, Wolf Singer and others suggested that the binding of features in experience, the fact that you see shapes tied to colors in objects in experience, that might be explained in part in terms of the coordinating role of these large-scale electrical patterns. There's some work by Bruna van Swinderen at the University of Queensland who does fruit fly work. This is flies, not even bees, pretty small nervous system, where there are beta range oscillations in the fruit fly brain that seem to have some association with attention in a fly. And it's also well known that those oscillatory patterns are important in sleep, in anesthesia, in all sorts of consciousness-related stuff. So I would suggest that, to put it in a somewhat compact and really, not much detail way, that the basis for conscious experience, for felt experience in animals, is the combination of a collection of features that give you subjectivity in a strong sense, that make you a subject, to whom things happen, something that has a centered perspective, all that kind of stuff. There's a set of subjectivity related features that are fairly schematic and that come from the evolution of agency. And then there's the weird properties of those control systems that we ended up with in our heads, nervous systems, brains. And there, I think the combination of those point-to-point influences, the more familiar network-based features of neural activity, and the more diffuse, large-scale oscillatory patterns. It's something about that combination I think is very important in explaining experience.
Awesome. I was so well explained. I love hearing you talk about this. I also had Nick Lane on the podcast. Incredible
Did you?
scientific
Okay.
writer.
Yeah.
And he agrees with you both as well that life seems critical. Now, fascinatingly, I've also had Dr. Robert Prentner on the podcast, who is a colleague of Donald Hoffman, who is in the consciousness is fundamental camp, which is just a completely different view.
Yeah.
The way you explain everything there is so interesting. I wanna go back to the very first stages in evolution when you think an organism was starting to integrate some senses and gaining its first levels of subjectivity. Say you have a very basic organism. It's starting to evolve sensors for the environment. The sensors are providing that organism useful information for its survival. You can think of subjectivity as in the integration of those early sensory signals into a unified signal of, okay, this is the state of me at the moment. Is that sort of how you envision it? That it might, the very first footsteps would be integrating one or two senses together, and then two or three, and then three or four, and then maybe there's a memory component, and then it gets a lot more complicated as the steps go. But the very first steps of subjectivity is really about integrating the information these sensors collect into one signal, which provides to the organism, am I safe? Am I good? Do I need to move this way? Do I need to move that way? Is that sort of how you think about things?
I think that's a reasonable sketch of the beginnings. Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think it's a problematic sketch. I think it's better than a lot of other sketches. If that's where one's starting, then I'm sure Nick Lane said something about this. Then we're talking single cells. We're not just talking animals. We're talking single
Right.
cells.
Right.
Those sorts of features start very far back and are very widespread. For example, in your sketch just now, you had the accumulation of several sensory lines and then a little bit of memory.
Right.
If we look at bacteria, I mean, our familiar E. coli bacteria, they have a little bit of memory, and I think they do have some integration of different senses. But one of the things that makes their behavior effective, if you're a bacterium, you can detect good and bad chemicals around you, but you're so small you can't really tell the direction. Your body's too small to sort of track directionality with space. So what they do to get around this is use time to deal with space. The E. coli can register whether the chemical environment right now is better or worse than it was a moment ago. Do that comparison. So is it getting better or is it getting worse over a short time span? And if it's getting better, keep going in a straight line pretty much. If it's not getting better, if it's getting worse, do a random tumble and see if you can improve your situation. It's a very simple rule. It's no doubt very effective. It also has that little hint of memory. So it's an early stage in the history of integration of information,
Yes.
where it's not integration of one sense with another, but integration of what I sense now with what I sensed. You've got to make the comparison. You've got to be able to tell whether the environment now is a little better or a little worse than it was a moment ago.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but basically, the sort of thing you're sketching, I think it's a reasonable sketch, where there's a kind of de facto sensitivity that any form of cellular life will have. Things will affect what's going on. You don't need to make yourself sensitive. You'll just be sensitive, especially because as a metabolizing object, you've got to have channels to the world. You can't be completely closed off. So things will affect you. It's natural to evolve some ways of putting those impacts, those stimuli to use, start to work out, whether this is telling you something worth knowing, even if it's just knowing that there's a good chemical around and then being able to, either stay in the same area or follow that path. That's a kind of information processing step. Start to integrate different sensory lines, start to integrate the present with the past. And no sudden switching on of the lights, no moment where suddenly, everything is conscious, whereas, one step before that it wasn't. I think very, very likely the picture will end up with is a strongly gradualist view, one in which everything comes into being very gradually. But those things you were describing are the origin of the subjectivity related suite of features we were talking about a moment ago. And then at some point you have the origin of nervous systems as one kind of control device, not the only kind. Bacteria do fine, plants do fine doing things differently, but once you get nervous systems with that combination of networked and more holistic properties, I think that's a big deal. That's a big deal too. And they're just in animals, nearly all animals, but that's an animal invention. So we could summarize it by saying the sketch you gave gives an outline of the origin of subjectivity, both inside and outside animals, even in single-celled forms, and nervous systems add something special when they arise.
Right. It's a beautiful explanatory framework. I think it's kind of one that I hope to be true. It's just so nice. I think you can see the story and it feels right. What's a really interesting step, I think, to zoom in on, and then maybe it is what you say, the creation of the nervous system is this step, is when you go from a rule-based integration of sensus, as in integrating 5 sensus, and then you have a basic rule book of, move forward towards the light, move away, move towards this chemical. Oh, this chemical is in this concentration, move towards it even fast. Like, when does it go from that kind of rule-based system where it might just have a domain of behaviors, like an actual domain where you could list out the behaviors based on the integration of these sensors, to this insanely complicated nervous system type thing, which it doesn't feel like a domain of behaviors, although maybe it just is. Maybe it's an incredibly complicated, very large, wide-ranging domain of behaviors. Like, we can react in a particular way to a set of stimulus now, and maybe what we have is an incredibly complicated rule-based system. Do you believe that, or do you think it's categorically different?
Well, there's got to be a stage in the story where learning becomes significant, where we go beyond having a sort of a set range of behaviors with their associated triggers to a situation where you can start to use the past as a guide to what kind of thing you should be doing next time this experience comes around. So learning is part of it, and that's a plausible thing that nervous systems are at least very good at. The question of whether there are forms of learning in some single-celled organisms, protists, not bacteria so much, paramecia and the like, that is interestingly unresolved. And there's also unresolved questions about whether plants have a little bit of this. But certainly nervous systems are a big deal in relation to learning. Classical or Pavlovian conditioning is just all over the place in the animal kingdom. Not everywhere, but very, very common. Learning based on reward, less common, a bit more scattered through the animal kingdom, not perhaps so easy to evolve, but still, very conspicuous in behaviorally complicated animals like, ourselves, the arthropods, the cephalopods. So plasticity, I think, is a big thing. When you contrast, a rule book picture with alternatives, I guess right. There's two dimensions of departure from a rule book picture. One is just plasticity. Are you always trying to change the rules? Basically, are you using past experience to come up with a new way of responding next time a thing of this kind comes around? There's plasticity, and there's stochasticity. There's a less deterministic character to the way nervous systems handle these things. How important that is, to what extent that's just a feature of how nervous systems work rather than a sort of deep design feature, I don't know. Some neuroscientists like Walter Freeman have argued it's really important. It's really deep in neural systems. They're inherently stochastic, and that really matters. So you've got, right, there's a departure in the direction of plasticity, and there's a departure in the direction of it being more stochastic, more holistic, less governed by relatively discrete procedures. And now we're getting to territory where I'd be cautious, even more even than I have been in offering speculations on this. But
Yes.
putting my playground marbles in the ring, I would bet on the importance of all of those features.
Yeah.
All those ones I just listed.
What do you think is so special about humans that gives us such a rich subjective experience? I mean, the first one you could think of is language, right? I mean, that's what we seem to have, or definitely have, a very complex language that other animals don't have. But why would language imbue us with such a rich subjective experience?
I think language probably is a very big deal. Right. So I'm on the side of the camp that treats language itself, public, the social tool of language, as a transformer of human psychology, rather than the camp that sees language as just a manifestation of something else that was the big difference maker, the transformer. So in this way, I see myself as, not with Chomsky and more with a Vygotskian sort of picture. Right? Why so important? Well, I don't want to exaggerate. There's a recent paper by Stan Dehane and his collaborators that's made me sort of think again about some of this, where they try to push back on the idea that it's language itself rather than a kind of organization of information that language is part of. They push back a bit against the idea that language itself is important. But I've certainly been impressed by work that argues that it is language itself that's important, that when you internalize this format for representation, what you're taking on board is this extraordinary, flexible, and well-organized way of stringing ideas together, putting one thing in conjunction and in logical relations with another, bringing things together so that you can do inference on them and consider them. As a sort of format for organized processing, I think language, may be a very big deal with a deep role in the human brain. So, in response to your question of a moment ago, yeah, I think language is probably a very good first answer to that question.
What's maybe a useful analogy for people to understand? Because I think that's kind of quite a complex idea. I'm struggling to wrap my head around it, of why language helps us unify so much experience into simple words. Is that simply it? That what language does is a compression device of countless different experiences.
Not just a compression device, but a kind of concatenation device. So we can now use language to bring together ideas from very disparate fields that might never have been brought together before in that way. Lay them alongside each other, look at logical relations between those ideas and others. Inner speech inner speech as opposed to public speech is interesting here. Something I emphasize a little bit in the second two books, Metazoa and Living on Earth, is the way that inner speech has, it has properties that ordinary speech doesn't have. It can it can orchestrate a kind of multimedia event as opposed to just a string of sounds or marks on a page. So, as a person reflects and runs through an internal monologue, they can summon up a memory of a smell and categorize that linguistically, a memory of a sound and consider that linguistically. The linguistic part of the monologue can act as an organizer for sensory and other remembered elements that are not themselves linguistic. They have a sort of different structure, but they can be managed with reflective internal monologue type processing. Now, as I say this, I always am reminded of the fact that apparently, and this is surprising to me, there's a lot of divergence between individuals, difference between individuals in how strong their internal monologue is. I mean, I
Yes.
am in a very strong camp, I imagine. It's hard to know, but it's just, a very big part of my inner life. And I have met people, including people I know well and have done philosophy with, who just say they don't think like that. They just say their minds
Yeah.
work differently.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing. Or potentially a big thing. I'm not quite sure what to make of that.
I had Dr. Russell Hurlburt on the podcast, who is
Oh, right.
the
Yeah.
originator of the inner sampling method, where you get a bleeper, and then basically the idea is when it beeps, you try and recall in as much detail as possible what you were experiencing in the second before the beep.
Yeah.
And my conversation with him, I think, is what evoked this incredible curiosity in subjective inner experience. This idea that people were going to Dr. Hilbert saying, I inner monologue all the time, 10 hours per day. I'm 100% confident that I inner monologue. Like, I think you're wrong that it's that people don't. Like, let's do this test. And he would sit with them for 30 days in interviews with the beeper. And then by the end of the 30 days, he's had people be like, I actually don't inner monologue at all. I was 100% confident that I did, and I don't. And I have a second example of this, which also blows my mind. I've been speaking to a number of people with aphantasia. Have you heard of aphantasia? Yeah.
Yeah.
I am just while speaking to an expert on aphantasia, my sister works with me and she was editing a podcast. And in the trailer for this apple test came up, which is very simply like, can you close your eyes and visualize an apple? And she just didn't think twice about it. She closed her eyes and was like, why not? I'll give this a try. We now have realized she has full blown sensory aphantasia. And she's 31 years old and she's had creative jobs her whole life and she's been very successful in different careers and she's highly intelligent, but she didn't know that she not only cannot visualize imagery in her head, but she can't imagine taste, she can't imagine smell, she can't imagine touch. We're unsure if she can imagine motor sequences. She just didn't know. She didn't know that she can't imagine those things or experience those things.
What's the relation in a case like that? What's the relation to episodic memory?
Yeah,
What can she
I think
can
they co-present so aphantasia co-presents a lot with severely deficient autobiographical memory. I don't think they always do,
but your
but it
sister, does she have unusual memory?
not that I ever would have noticed. She did very well in exams in school, got very high points in, could have done any course in college. She thinks of her memories a little bit differently, I think. They have a rich emotional context. But like my whole life, I never would have assumed that she had any memory difficulties. Again, did very well in school, which is arguably a memory test in a lot of ways. But what was
Well,
most fascinating,
different kind, but semantic memory and episodic memory, I assume, are
sure.
still regarded as pretty different. I'm just wondering, right? She can remember how songs sound, or she can't remember how songs sound.
See, you kind of have to be, there's a language problem here with subjective experience, right? So like, I think the way you phrased the question there, she probably could remember how a song sounds, but she couldn't play it in her head. So the problem is
Yeah,
like generating the perception, generating it in her head.
right,
And if you
right.
ask her to hum it out loud, she could probably do it. But having that experience in her head, she can't imagine it. She has to actually simulate it. It's very strange. It's
Yeah,
very weird. And This has
That's
only happened in
interesting.
the last few weeks that where we've realized this, and we've tested it many times, and it's kind of blowing her mind and it's blowing my mind. And it's just why I'm so fascinated in the work that you've done on like what is inner subjective experience? What is it for other animals? I think you really set the stage for moving the conversation away from humans to other animals, which I think has just ignited so much conversation. It's just fascinating to me. I absolutely love it. I love thinking about it. It's why I was so interested in speaking with you. I think it's the coolest problem in the world.
It is the coolest problem in the world. It is.
What hey, let's finish on a few big picture questions.
Okay.
Why the way that this model of consciousness and subjective experience that you've laid out makes so much sense to me. It really does. But the thing that doesn't make sense is why haven't we made more progress? If it is a brain process, if there's things in the brain that's creating consciousness, why haven't we figured more stuff out about how consciousness is working in the brain?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, I think we took a wrong turn with the very computational direction
Interesting.
of inquiry from the late 20th century onwards. But that can't be
Interesting.
that much of an explanation, because there's been tons of ordinary neuroscience that hasn't been really affected by that picture, just ordinary
Yeah.
neuroscience. And,
I wonder how
I
Anna would respond to that, being a computational consciousness neuroscientist.
uh um, the right how mysterious is it? I don't. This is very impressionistic, but I don't find it puzzling that we haven't gotten further. I guess I think it is
Interesting.
hard. I don't expect us to be in the dark forever, so to speak. The view called Mysterianism in philosophy, the idea that we'll just never know, that there's some in principle reason why we'll never work this out. I see no reason to accept a view like that, and no reason to accept one of the truly radical panpsychist options or some other picture that would completely transform the overall landscape. I think the difficulties of our perspectives, the fact that we are studying using our own experience and perspective, what it is to have experience and a perspective, that is a source of difficulty. Um, yeah, so the idea that it's baffling we haven't gotten further doesn't strike me that way.
Interesting. I just, like neuroscience has progressed slower than maybe other fields just by the nature of the technology that we have and how difficult it is to study the brain. It still feels like we're pushing forward in those areas. We're figuring out mechanisms of memory, we're figuring out mechanisms of attention and focus. And consciousness just seems like a black box. I am do you think there's a subunit of subjective experience? What's the indivisible quanta of consciousness?
I doubt that that's a good way to think about it. Yeah,
Interesting.
I,
Okay,
I,
tell me
I
why.
would. Oh no, I just wouldn't see any reason to think there was such a thing, a quantum. I mean, maybe there is, but why think there is? Why is it a natural way to approach it?
Well, if we accept that we're more conscious than an ant, but an ant might be somewhat conscious, don't we? Doesn't there have to be some physical measurement of the difference between us?
Yeah, okay. In that sense, I didn't think you were asking about a unit in that sense. The sense
Yeah,
I
like
would
a
resist
physical.
is the idea that in a human right now there are 4 trillion qualia units, and in
Yeah,
the ant there's only 100,000 or something like that. Uh, Resist a unit-based treatment of experience itself. I think experience is a feature of biological systems of a certain kind with a certain complexity. I agree with you that as they get less complex, there's a sense in which they probably have less of this thing, and I expect a future picture to be very gradualist about those relationships. And then, right, the question we come to is the sort of question we were touching on when you mentioned Nick Lane earlier, which is, Is there a glimmer of this in single-celled organisms? There's a kind of glimmer of subjectivity, but they don't have the neural features that I think do matter a lot. So is it just an animal thing? Those are the questions we get back to. And I think of those as really central questions.
Yeah. How do you think we push the field forward? What should the next few decades in consciousness research look like under your view?
Okay, well, I'll say something that's a little not left field, but probably different from most answers in a certain respect, which is, I've become very concerned about the ethical side of invasive neuroscience, neuroscience on behaviorally complex and probably sentient animals, including octopuses. For a while, there was quite a bit of talk about octopuses becoming a model organism. And as a model organism for developmental biology, that's not a big problem. As a model organism for neuroscience, I think it can get pretty ugly pretty quickly, I have to say.
Right.
They're hard animals to study humanely if you're going to do invasive work. I'm glad that there's pushback at the moment going on against various kinds of invasive animal experiments, especially in the US. I think it's time for a certain amount of rethinking in that area, and that will have the consequence that there may be a temporary slowdown with respect. If there was a reduction in the amount of invasive work on sentient animals, there'd be a temporary slowdown, and that's a shame. But I don't think it would end progress in the medium or longer term. I'd like to see a rethinking of the use of animals in this kind of work.
Definitely. I mean, that's got to be an argument for computational models, right?
Which is awkward for me, right? If I thought computation was everything, I'd be able to say, go off and just get a regular computer with the usual architecture and build a more sophisticated system and you'll be fine. Right. I don't think that. So it's a bit of an awkward combination.
Peter, this has been so much fun. I loved the last 45 minutes. I thought we tackled some super interesting areas, some pieces where both of us obviously run into a wall. I've learned so much from you. I've learned so much from your books, and I try and carry that through all of my podcasts. So I'm so grateful for your books. I'm so grateful for your work as a scientific communicator. And just thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you, Evan. I enjoyed it very much also. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you so much for watching that episode with Dr. Peter Godfrey-Smith, an absolute legend in the space of consciousness, especially animal consciousness. If you're interested in watching more, then I really couldn't recommend more. My episode with Anil Seth, we go into optical illusions, what emotions and consciousness mean together, if AI can be conscious. Really fascinating questions at the moment, and I thought we had a really great conversation. As always, subscribe to the channel. Let me know who you want me to talk to next, and thank you so much for the support.